really one of the key things I always go back to is thinking about how you're going to prioritize, and using a risk-based approach is going to be, the best way to do that. All attack surfaces are different. They can span thousands, even hundreds of thousands, or more assets that are out there on the internet, right? And so without a way to effectively prioritize, you're not going to be able to be effective, right? I see it all the time, organizations wasting a lot of time chasing false positives and low impact issues because they lack that structured approach to prioritization. And so you really need to be able to separate the difference between noise and actual threats so that you can respond to the real issues as they arise. So I like to think of it as, focusing on a couple of factors, right? So exploitability, time of the exposure, and then business impact. But more, from a real world perspective, how do you actually implement something like that? So firstly, you want to be validating the findings. So implementing exploit-based verification means that you can focus on the real issues that actually matter. So you're already starting to cut down on the noise because the only things you should be getting alerted to are actually real and exploitable. And so to put this into context, if this isn't something you're familiar with, where we sort of came from, right? Traditional vulnerability scanners, which I'm sure most people on this call would have used in the past, the way that they work is, they look at an asset, it's very much point and shoot. You've got to tell it what to scan, and then you say, scan this asset. It'll come back with a list of different technologies that are running, the version numbers, and then cross-reference that with a long CVE database. And what you end up with is usually a very long list of potential exposures, right? And that adds to the noise, it adds to the complexity of how do we figure out what's actually real, because it doesn't take into account, are these things actually real and exploitable, right? Sometimes issues are patched out without incrementing a version number. Sometimes there might be a compensating control, right? So the modern way of looking at this and scaling it across this many assets is to look at exploit-based testing. The next layer you want to be looking at is around the importance of the assets that you're trying to protect, right? Not all assets and systems are going to be, equal. An internet-facing dev server isn't going to carry the same risk as a production database, right? So assigning context-driven importance to these assets will help you align, how you're going to respond to these and, what your objectives are as a business. If you find a medium-rated issue in a development server or a lower priority asset, that's going to get treated very differently than, hey, if you found a critical issue in a critical asset, that's probably a drop everything moment and go deal with it, right? And then the last part to this is to focus on impact. So, I understand security teams are often, just overloaded with so many different things that they need to try and work on, right? And sometimes the default can be, let's just work through this in order of what was discovered, or let's look at the risk register and start working through these things. But, like that last customer example I just gave you, being able to respond quickly to new changes in your environment, maybe there's a new emerging threat, or perhaps there's been an advisory about, a particular hacker group that's now targeting and exploiting a certain issue in the wild. You should be able to shift focus and say, okay, well, this week we're concerned about this technology. Let's go focus on that. And so these three things together will allow you to really prioritize, what are the things that you should be focusing on any given day, right? So firstly, we're validating the findings, making sure they're actually real. So you've already cut down a lot. You're then understanding the context around how important it is, what that impact might be on the business. And then we're looking at the impact of the actual bug and whatever that may be. And so all those things together will mean that teams can quickly and efficiently respond to actual real exposures across their attack surface.